Okay, next I want to talk about some of the cultural geography of East Asia, and particularly China, that just some background, a little bit of historical background, that China has a long history of being an empire. That um, there's more detail in this, but generally there is a lineage called the Han Dynasty, which is a thousands of year lineage up to fairly recently into the early 1900s. And from that name Han comes the term Hanification. Also sometimes called Sinization, but Hanification, or the Chinese consider themselves the people of the Han. The Han is also the name of the dominant ethnic group in China. So when we say Chinese, oftentimes there are other minorities because China is such a large country that it encompasses people of different backgrounds. But the Han, the Chinese generally consider themselves to be the people of the Han. And Han is also the dominant Chinese language. It's also called Mandarin. Just by contrast, in the South, where you have different language called Yu, also called Cantonese, that being said, that Han is really the dominant language throughout China. So the Han are the kind of the ethnic or cultural group that's dominant in China. Then there's also a collection of minorities, such as people related who are Turkic peoples that are related to people in Central Asia, like the Stan countries. So here's a larger view. You have, if you go all the way to the west, you actually have people who are Kazakhs and Tajiks, people in south of Russia, East Asia, and Central Asia. There are different cultural groups in Tibet and a little bit of cultural diversity in the south of China, but then you have this large swath of Han Chinese. And so the short of it is, there is a term that the Chinese use. They consider themselves the people of the Han. Now, there has been, China does have some colonial history, but different than places like Africa, because Chinese largely remained an independent empire even during the colonial period, but not all of China. That parts of China were taken over sometimes by force, by the British, including, and sometimes by trade. A couple that I'll highlight here: Formosa, which is modern day Taiwan, was colonized by Japan up until Japan lost it in the end of World War II. Another couple were Macau, which was a small Portuguese colony, a center of trade for Portugal initially, and then Hong Kong, which was controlled by the British Empire until the 1990s. Okay, so during the colonial era, Japan itself was an empire, and it had taken, and it itself took over parts of China, including islands like Formosa. You also had European empires who took over bits, including places like Hong Kong and Macau. And you had a group that emerged in the 1900s called the Chinese nationalists. And the Chinese nationalists kind of arose to get rid of these Europeans and Japanese who had taken over parts of their country. And so by 1920s, they expelled the Europeans. They fight against Japan in World War II. They were, United States actually supported the nationalists during that time. But at the same time, they also had a rival group called the Chinese Communists that they were battling with as well. So it was a time of a lot of turmoil in China as they had to battle Japan and also a communist revolt. Now, the nationalists end up on the losing end of this fight, that the Chinese communists, the communist revolt, ends up taking over mainland China, and they kick the nationalist government out. And where the nationalist government goes is over here to the, now that Japan has given up Formosa, they take over this, and it's now Taiwan. And the Chinese communists, after kicking out the nationalists who are now over in Taiwan, established the PRC, the People's Republic of China, or the country of China that we know today. A little bit of background, a little bit of historical background, because this is, the reason why we're going over this is because it has a lot to do with the economic dramatic economic changes that we've seen in China, that it didn't start out that way. It started out with a communist economy, centrally planned, and Mao Zedong, which was the first communist leader up to the 1970s, had a number of programs for complete government control of the economy, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution. But many of these, especially ones that controlled agriculture in the country, were failures because it led to the death of millions of people because of mismanagement of the food supply. So after he dies and a new leader takes over, Deng Xiaoping, after Mao, he had a famous quote that maybe it sounds different in Chinese, but what he would say is, it doesn't matter the color of the cat as long as it hunts mice. And whatever that means, what he was trying to say is that what's wrong with having some open market reforms? And that's what he does. He starts to reform the Chinese economy, loosens government control, and opens it up for a free market system. Okay, here I want to take a closer view. This is Macau, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. Remember, the nationalists are expelled and they go to Taiwan. Hong Kong belongs to the British, and Macau belongs to the Portuguese. Now, so you have China, the People's Republic of China, the dominant country. You have Taiwan, confusingly called the ROC, a Republic of China. Then it formerly a Japanese colony that taken over by the nationalists. Now, mainland China, the PRC, considers Taiwan to be a, quote, wayward province. In other words, China does not acknowledge Taiwan as being an independent country, but sees it more as a part of China that is just sort of gone wayward and that could be reclaimed by China at any time. And a more complicated system developed between Hong Kong and Macau down here, that both Portugal and the British gave back these territories to the Chinese. I'm going to include a little bit more detail on especially for Hong Kong, that back in the 1940s, the British entered it into an agreement that they would give back Hong Kong in 50 years. And at the time, it sounded like, well, God knows what's going to happen in 50 years. That could be an eternity. But they were stuck to it. Then in the 1990s, they had to turn it back over to China. Same goes with Macau. By 1999, Macau, the former Portuguese colony, is also returned to China. So now they are part of China, but they are governed differently because they had a history of democracy, self-rule. So what China has really done is set up something called one country, two systems, and established Hong Kong and Macau as SARs, or special administrative regions. In other words, there are different laws and regulations that govern Hong Kong and Macau than there are in mainland China. One reason for that is because these are money makers for China. This is Hong Kong, a center of trade in the region for many years. It's one of what we call the Asian tigers that we'll talk about shortly. It's an economic powerhouse in Asia. Macau is a little different. Macau is sort of the Las Vegas of Asia, but it is bigger than Las Vegas. It is, I think, gosh, I don't remember the statistics, but it's like 8 times the gambling revenue for Las Vegas. Don't quote me on that, but it's big. It's sort of their Las Vegas. And so these are both big money makers for China. So they've been delicate in how they've treated these SARs, special administrative regions.